Neil, what's going on? What is the Rugby League Record Keepers Club? What is it? Why is it important? What are you doing?
So Rugby League Record Keepers Club was originally started about 50 years ago. So in the 1970s, a guy called Irving Saxton basically started a huge piece of work and did that in conjunction with the Rugby Football League to categorise games and come up with an official record of the sport. So up until that point, nothing had been done. No real detailed records had necessarily been kept by clubs or by individuals, certainly not in any coordinated way, and nothing by the authorities either. And there were disputes over certain records at the time, and who scored most points, well, there wasn't much dispute about who scored most tries by that point, at least. But yeah, there was lack of clarity on how many tries people like Brian Bevan had actually scored, and no consensus on numbers because different people counted things in different ways. So what Irving and a group of historians and statisticians did was basically categorise all of those games and agree what counted as official matches and what were friendly games and therefore outside the records. So that became the canon of the game, I suppose, from a record-keeping point of view, and not just the categorisation of that, but then found, through newspaper reports, searching in libraries, that sort of thing, the full details of pretty much all of those games, very, very close to all of those games, and created that comprehensive record. So that work took the best part of 20 odd years, I think, and by the mid-90s, they'd got everything up to date, so they had that complete record. And there were existing publications kicking around at the time that meant that was being updated on an annual basis. So the original Record Keepers Club wound up then. And then, nothing more was kind of heard of it for the best part of 20 years. And people still had copies of the old information that had been published. But that was all in paper form, just in hard copies that was kicking around. And that wasn't really widely accessible and certainly not freely available online and or anything like that. So there was quite a bit of chat on social media as these things kind of snowball, I suppose, and suggestions about reforming the Record Keepers Club, which is what a few of us got together at the back end of 2019 and thought, yeah, there's a germ of an idea here. Maybe we should start to think about restarting things and possibly bring this into the 21st century, which is where I kind of came in, really.
Everyone loves databases and spreadsheets. I used to work with them when I had a proper job in the past. How much work has had to go into digitizing, I guess, all this information from the history of the sport?
A huge amount, and it's been spread amongst a large group of people, really. We were fortunate, I think, from a timing point of view, and fortunate with circumstances, if it's right to kind of use that phrase, I suppose, given all what's been going on, to almost seem to take advantage of it, but by luck rather than anything else, obviously. So yeah, we from some initial meetings and discussions at the back end of 2019, I kind of took the lead on trying to contact different historians and club statisticians and see if there was much appetite out there to, get a coordinated approach going to get things started again and share stuff online and get things digitized, like you say. And there was definitely a real uptake and people thinking it was a great idea. And what was probably lacking was somebody putting themselves forward to coordinate that. And I guess I blinked first. So I ended up almost by default having made a lot of contact with people and starting to coordinate those activities and try to give some structure to the gathering of the data in an electronic format. And we decided to open that up to anybody who was wanting to be involved and relaunch the club officially and, let people sign up as members. And we decided to do this, obviously, a few weeks to months earlier, but we actually launched on the 1st of April 2020. which just happened to be about a week after everyone was told that they weren't allowed to step out their houses and had to find themselves something else to do. Fortunately, that meant that we all of a sudden had quite a lot of rugby folk who couldn't get to games, couldn't do a lot else, and wanted to help pass the time and keep themselves interested. And all of a sudden there's an interesting project here that needs someone to spend a lot of time sat in front of a computer typing in information from paper sheets. We suddenly found that we had quite a lot of willing volunteers that maybe if the season had been going on and people have had other distractions, wouldn't have been the case. So we were quite fortunate, probably from that point of view, to suddenly have willing, able people who all looked in. And essentially by the end of 2020, we'd got all of those handwritten sheets typed up, covering some 55,000 games, I think, from the first 100 years of the sport. So that's a lot of player entries and tries scored, and a huge amount of data to input, but spread across a good few dozen people with a fair bit of time on their hands. It was quite doable over that 9 months or so.
I mean, obviously today everything should be as accurate as possible because the games are broadcast. There's a load of media there. I mean, unfortunately, for example, in the Women's Super League last year, there was a game between Wakefield and Huddersfield. I was the only media person there, and I did take my eye off the game at one point and miss whether a conversion went over or not. So I'm not sure what the final score was. So the only person who will know will be the referee on that occasion. But I guess you can only go on what's the records of the time have been from all the games, 100 and odd years ago.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's so you tend to find that it's certain times of year where there's problems. Christmas and Easter. If there's any blanks ever in club records, it's usually around about that time, because specifically over Easter, that if papers were being published on the Saturday, you'd have had the game played on the Friday, then you've got the game that day, then you've got a game the following day, and maybe another midweek one before the next week's publication's out. So the chances of those 3 or 4 games getting a full write-up and teams listed and all the scorers mentioned is a bit remote in some instances. So that tends to be where you get blanks. Players' names, first names of players, people have spent huge amounts of time piecing bits of jigsaws together, trying to fill those in. But there's still, my club's Warrington. We've done quite a lot of work there. We've got over 100 players, I think, which is probably about 7 or 8% of the players that have ever played a first team match who we've still not got a first name for, because it's hard to get, basically, because the records don't exist from the time. So it is a very time consuming exercise, almost club by club, to piece things together. And that's probably underpinned our approach, I think, from the record keepers this time round. And one of my main activities really is trying to find out who's the people that's invested that time and done that research and got access to that information, because that's who we want on board, and that's who we want to be kind of sharing that for the greater good of the game. But yeah, it's challenging at times to fill all of those blanks in, for sure.
I mean, something that must be challenging, and I was thinking about this earlier, because I had a look on the website, I had a look at a few of the things that are there, and obviously it's not all up there at the moment, but the likes of Chorley Borough, because there are 2 Chorley boroughs, and they split off, and one's from the Highton family and one's goes off to become Trafford Borough. And I mean, how do you reconcile all these different clubs that were the same lineage? Do you have them all as separate clubs? Because as much as I can joke that Bradford Bulls 2014 are not the same as Bradford Bulls 1996, for all intents and purposes, of course they are, but these were clubs who became different entities.
Yeah, and we've gone back and ruled on all of that stuff effectively. So there's some long accepted practice in some of that. So the old, I suppose one of the first, and when you think about it with hindsight, one of the craziest kind of moves of Wigan Highfield relocating down to London and becoming London Highfield, and having a couple of seasons, one season down there, I think it was, before they then returned and became Liverpool City. We talk about some of the things going on today with clubs moving around, but that was something going on in the 1930s, and players getting a train down from up north to play down in London on a Wednesday night on the floodlights. It is just a crazy situation, but that's long been accepted. That was the same club. A lot of those players actually from Wigan Highfield did play for London Highfield the following season. So we judge each of those things on its own merits, and there's different criteria as to what you can look at to kind of rule is a club a continuation of the one that went before. So a player's retained, is the name retained, or elements of the name retained? Are the club colours retained? Is it the same ownership and just a different town or ground that they're playing out of? And there's a spectrum along which, some of those things are really obviously just one team moving to a stadium on the other side of town, and all other things staying the same. Then you get things that get a little bit more tenuous as you go over time, and there's a tipping point, but it's a judgmental tipping point. And we've gone back and on all of those contentious points kind of given our view, which might be acceptable to some people. People might have different views on some of that, so we're not saying it's the definitive, but we're saying that for our purposes, for what we're going to do from a record keeping point of view, this is the approach that we're going to take, and we'll share as much information as we can as to why we've concluded that, and then people can, I guess, make their own decisions as to whether they agree or not.
Whereas I would be in the camp of when we got to Wembley last year in the 1895 Cup final, the York who was there was not the York who were there 90 years ago, whatever. It's tricky, isn't it? Because as you say, everyone's got an opinion on what is a continuation of the same club.
Yeah, and York's an interesting one. I mean, you've got, there's a number of indicators there that suggest that you might know the year better than me, 2013, was it 2012? Did they
something like that?
Through? Yeah. They stop partway through a season. That's unhelpful because then they have a period where they're not playing. That's one of the things when you've got a break in play that counts against you, I suppose. And when they reformed, there was a lot of stuff that was new. I think the critical thing for the York situation, similar to the whole Sheffield conundrum around the 2000 time and their merger, is fan base was one of the key things that kind of retained. And although sometimes owners maybe want to distance themselves from the previous regime, there is a definite continuity of fans in a lot of those instances, and certain kind of key people behind the scenes maintaining involvement. And I think that's quite important when you boil it down to the essence of what actually is a club. Clearly the fans and the people who have got that emotional attachment to the team bearing their town name typically, then that's one of the key kind of attributes. So in instances where that's broken, it starts to maybe lead you down a different path in terms of it being a new entity. But in a lot of instances, I think we would conclude that there is continuity when certain factors are still changing.
And much like in football, where I think the team who won the FA Cup in 1988, who currently play in Milton Keynes, do not claim to have won the FA Cup in 1988, despite the fact they are obviously the continuation of that club. That's where it gets messy, where it's emotion is brought into things. And it must be difficult to tear apart emotion from stats, which are just numbers on a page. They can't be, well, they can be disputed, but they shouldn't be disputed in a sense.
Yeah, and I think one of the points I've made a few times, I think, is the thing with the stats is they're not the history of the game, but it's impossible to tell the history of the game without them. So, you can't talk about Brian Bevan without mentioning numbers. And I'm a Warrington fan, so I'll mention Bevan whenever we start talking about stats. But it's impossible to kind of talk about his career without at some point mentioning 796 tries, and the fact that it's a locked on number of 796 tries is quite helpful, I think, because at least then there is an agreement of what he achieved in that sense. And that brings an introduction almost to then the flavour that, you need to kind of add to really tell a story. And then people can start talking about individual tries that he scored. And that's where the really interesting stuff maybe comes through. So, the stats aren't the history, but it's impossible to ignore them when you're talking about what's been before, I think.
And those records like Brian Bevan's, Neil Fox's, etc. They are never going to be broken, and never going to even be close to being broken. We saw with Kevin Sinfield in his career; he got nowhere near Neil Fox's numbers. I know Fox played a lot longer than Sinfield, but they obviously played a lot more games in the past than they do today.
Yeah, I think that's the thing. I think that you're actually seeing in quite a lot of sports now that some of those all-time records are getting close to being broken, or have been broken. And be that, and you're talking a wide variety of sports, so everything from soccer through to tennis, Grand Slam titles have gone and are all modern players who are right up there in terms of who's won the most. And that's really because, the advances in medical science and the attention to the recovery and the fitness levels that the guys at the top of their sport have got is such that whilst it's not typical to have careers of 20 years, you're now seeing careers of that length. And from players, from the Ronaldos, from the Bradys, from the Nadals and Djokovic's of the world, they're having careers which last for significantly longer periods of time than the average, and at the top of their career for that long. The bit with rugby, with it being an attritional type of sport, is there's a limit to what you can do there, and we're never going to go back to playing 40, 45 games a season. Much as sometimes you think Super League might want to have enough loop games to fit that in, I don't think we're quite going to get back there. So 35 is probably the upper limit that you can have. So unless someone comes along who's going to score at a significantly higher rate per game, then those records are never even going to get close to being broken. But I don't know, could I see someone scoring 5,000 points in a career? Yeah, I think that's possible. But Neil Fox is on 6,200 nods, so he's still got a pretty sizable buffer, you think, there. And Bevan probably even more so. I think if a Fire, who had quite a long career playing only for the champion team pretty much for the duration of that, and can't get within 250, then there's not much hope for anybody else, I don't think.
And Neil Fox, of course, scored his tries when there were 3 points, rather not that most of his points were tries, but still, you had those, add some extra points on there, make it even bigger. Of course, one of the great things, of course, in our sport is the fact that the Australians think none of our records count, and theirs are all the records that start over there. But that's the Australians for you. You mentioned what does count and what doesn't count as a match. And one of my bugbears, and I know you've picked up on this because I know you've tweeted about this recently, is all these people who are currently making debuts and scoring their first tries for club and are not making their debuts or scoring their first tries for clubs, because if they did, then Johnny Vegas would have a heritage number for St Helens. And as far as I'm aware, he doesn't, because he played in a friendly. Yeah.
I think I remember being at Gary Chambers and Chris Rudd had a dual testimonial, and the game that they played, I think for about 5 minutes they played with an inflatable sheet rather than a ball. So I think for good reason some of those games are not included in official records. The boundary has definitely been drawn in the right place, I think, for those. There's what you term it if it's not a debut, I guess, is the discussion point. First appearance or making their bow or something like that. All of that's acceptable. Debut should be a protected term. Maybe we need to somehow get it trademarked or whatever you would have to do.
It's put in the Rugby League Media Guide. You can't call them debuts unless they're actually in proper official matches. As an aside, the 1955 ITA Television Trophy or Associated Reading, whatever it's called, Warrington won it. Are they official matches? Because in the Wakefield programme the week before, and I can't remember who they played the week before, but it does mention that they're friendlies or challenge matches or something. Are they official matches or not?
Yes, they are. So the rule of thumb, or the diktat, I suppose, that was kind of agreed, is that if the RFL were involved in the selection of the teams to take part or somehow in organising the tournament, then that's an official competition. So that's where you've got a distinction to Warrington played a friendly in Dublin against Wigan in the 1930s. And that was just a promoter reaching out, wanting a couple of high-profile teams to go over there and play a match, agreed with secretaries. The RFL then sanctioned the match, I believe, and signed off on the fact that as member clubs, I think they had to seek permission to be able to go and play in that game. But that was a private venture, if you like, and a private enterprise. So it wasn't a case that the promoter came to the RFL and said, I want the Challenge Cup winners and the league winners to come over and play. He just happened to, decide on those two particular clubs, or they showed willing. And that was how that was arranged. So that's therefore not an official match. And there was another cup, I think that was in Dublin as well, that was played over in Ireland, where the team, I think that was a 4-team competition. And that was done in the opposite way, where it was arranged through the RFL. They had a hand in selecting the teams. I think it was originally going to be something like the top 4 teams, but then I think Britain were touring or something, and 2 of the clubs ended up decimated. So they actually ended up subbing a couple of others in who finished 5th and 6th. So it looks a bit messy from the outside, but the RFL had their hands all over that and were involved in setting the tournament up. Therefore, that one counts as an example. So there is definitely stuff in the margins that when you first look at it, doesn't look immediately obvious as to why it's in. But yeah, rest assured, there's been quite a lot of rigor and rationale ruled on all of those sorts of things. Hopefully we've got them all right.
I'm going to have to go back through the programmes for the final of the Blackpool Holiday Trophy or whatever it was in 1954 when Wakefield played Barrow, I think it was, which I don't know if that was sanctioned by the RFL or not. I'll have to check. Of course, the big controversial point on our programme, and has been for at least 3 years, is Mr. Schofield's 50th cap. He may not be with us, but he's always with us in spirit. And of course, he played for Great Britain against the rest of the world in 1988, but that one doesn't count as an international, does it?
It doesn't, no. And so that's black and white. That's beyond dispute and been ruled on. But yeah, joking aside on this, I was part of representing the Record Keepers Club. I've just been part of a big piece of work that International Rugby League have led, a long overdue piece of work, I think, to essentially do what the RFL and Irving and co did 40, 50 years ago for the domestic game. IRL have initiated and done that piece of work for the international game. They've done the men's so far. And that scope's been not expanded because it was always in scope to look at, to do the women's and the wheelchair as well, and to give basically a comprehensive list of these are, again, it's a view and it's a judgment, if you like, on some of those things, but this is what, from their perspective, they define as the definitive list of international matches. Unfortunately, the rest of the World Games don't get on there simply because they're not selected by the national governing body of a member organisation. They are what they are. They're selective teams of world-class players, no doubt, but not representative of an international member. So by definition, they can't be an international match, unfortunately.
So the game. Oh. Is it one of Mick Sullivan's caps was against Other Nations or something? That one does count.
Yes. So now you're really into the grey. You're really into the grey here. So I mean, Other Nationalities
This is what the people listening want. This is what they want.
Good. Well, let's give them what they want. Other Nationalities is a fascinating one. So you've got to look back at the origin of where Other Nationalities came from. So their first game was way back in 1904. They actually played in what is accepted, I think, as being the first international match of rugby league. It was still the Northern Union at the time and wasn't called rugby league then. But retrospectively, I suppose it is widely recognised as the first international match, and that was played against England. And that was at a time when, about 10 years post breakaway from rugby union. Rugby league, let's call it that for the sake of simplicity, didn't have any other nations effectively playing the game at that point. So whilst the county championship had been the kind of pinnacle from a representative point of view in Yorkshire, Lancashire, Cheshire, there was actually some pressure on that. Cheshire, some of the teams there had been wound up, so that was a shrinking pool. The North East, for example, had teams around the first decade of the sport, and that wasn't the case anymore. So your ability to play the kind of Northeast counties wasn't there anymore. So it was almost a shrinking pool from that representative team's point of view. And the game wanted something of I suppose a headline highlight type of match, and wanted to be able to have an international presence. Quite difficult given its geographical spread at the time. You know, there were players who'd migrated up from Wales even by that point. So there were enough non-English players kicking around that they could raise a team to oppose England and give a competitive match. So that was the thinking behind, you know, we need England to have an opponent, other nationalities, therefore they can play the best of the rest effectively. That was the kind of origin of that team. And they played sporadically through the next few decades. As the game then did expand and Wales became more of a force, and obviously Australia and New Zealand jumped on board. So the game did have a genuine international presence there. France in the 30s obviously started up as well. So through that time, other nationalities played the odd game. But then for various other political, rugby league politics reasons, and a desire to kind of, again, have meaningful international tournaments that were a bit more expanded post-war, with a real high caliber of overseas Australians and New Zealanders playing in the British game. Other nationalities was somewhat resurrected at that point, and actually took part in the European Championship. So England, Wales, France and other nationalities were the competing teams there, and other nationalities won that tournament a couple of times in that period, and with some of the most famous names in the sport ever representing them. So, you know, there's quite a long history and an interesting history there. We could talk even more about what they kind of move on to when they then later played in the county championship, which is an even more bizarre kind of twist to it. So, yeah, it's a really interesting history. Somebody needs to write something on that at some point, and we've got all the stats. If anybody needs and wants that, then again, you can't tell their story without those stats. But it would be good for somebody to flesh that out, I think.
Other nationalities as a county is as accurate as Lancashire and Yorkshire, which don't exist in the modern day, which of course they still brought back for the Origin games, which everyone's forgotten about and then wants to bring back on a regular basis. So the Exiles are not the other nationalities, and neither are the Combined Nations All-Stars, which of course I referenced in a tweet earlier today, but they contain English players who were spuriously in there for many and various reasons.
Yeah, I'd argue they're not. And again, it's to some degree, it's about applying some of those continuity criteria. It gets it even more murky when you're talking about representative teams, because that fan factor isn't really something you can bring into the mix. I don't know that you necessarily would have a natural affiliation maybe to some of those representative teams. So yeah, there's very different selection criteria for the teams over time. So Exiles had different criteria than other nationalities did. Combined Nations is different again. Yeah, I think on that selection criteria is one of the key things I think that differentiates those teams over time.
Basically, what we're saying then is rugby league is chaos, and its history is even more chaotic. And you've all got to try and pull this all together into some kind of semblance of sense, I guess.
Yeah, and you need a fairly methodical approach to it, I think, to be able to cut through some of that. But yeah, it's once you start unpicking things, there's elements of logic that you can start to apply at least. But it isn't. I think what I see one of our roles as doing is making sure that we're as clear and as transparent on why we've concluded things. so that kind of helps maybe educate or at least share with people new interesting things that maybe they didn't know before. So I think I'm always at pains to try to take the time to explain it, and hopefully people can see a logic to it and an understanding in what we've done. Whether they agree with it or not, again, it is subjective to some extent.
Yeah, I guess this will be the hardest question, but it sounds like the easiest one. What's the most interesting thing you've found in all the research so far in the 120 odd years of rugby league?
So that's a good question. I think the most interesting one for me is the story of England and I suppose the evolution of the top representative team from the RFL's point of view. So the really confusing period between the wars when there was two Englands, which were actually quite different things, which doesn't seem to make any sense when you look back at it through modern eyes. But you've got an England for the English, and then you've got an England which incorporates all of the British Isles, and that we would recognise as Great Britain now. And there's a lot of, I suppose, social history and geopolitical history that starts to kind of get interwoven into all of that, and a lot of implications on identity and all that sort of thing, and there's a lot of modern connotations for that, I guess, as well now. But that whole story of England and how the Northern Union evolved into England, into Great Britain, is probably another really interesting kind of evolutionary story, I think. And that's when you unpick that, and when you finally get your head around what's going on there, which takes some doing sometimes, I think. That's a really fascinating and interesting story, I think.
We can all learn from history. It is fascinating for people who want to get involved, Neil, and people might not be wanting to get involved in sticking stuff in spreadsheets and stuff. What are you looking for members of this club? How can people get involved, and what do they need to do to be involved?
Yeah, so our website, rugbyleaguerecords.com, has got more information about the club. It's where you can sign up to be a member. So it costs £5 to join. At the moment, the stats that we've got loaded into our database are just visible for members. That's not because we're trying to cash in on it. It is our full intention to make that publicly available as soon as we're comfortable with sharing it and the accuracy, and being able to load new information in there week to week. So that's what we're going to start doing from this weekend's games. So each week we'll be updating the stats for all of the current games that are being played. So hopefully within a couple of months, we'll have that process nice and slick, and then everybody can freely see that. But if you want to pay a £5 to see that straight away and to support our work, then that's really helpful. That just gives us a few quid in the bank that helps fund other stuff that we want to do, and keeps us on a sound footing, and allows us to kind of continue to do our work. Even if you don't want to do that and can't spare a £5, jump on the website. Certainly now, but in a couple of months' time, there'll be lots of information on there. Share that with former players who might want to see their records on there. We'll be tweeting stuff out to do with current things that's going on, trying to give some interesting information there. Share that with fellow fans who might find it interesting if it's related to your club. Stick it on some of the social media forums that I know people will be on. And I think just use what we've got available and what we're putting out there to help to maybe sow the seeds for some of those really interesting stories that the sport's full of, really. So I think everybody can kind of get involved in that way, really, and share some of the stats love around the rugby league community.
Stories, debates, and arguments. That's what it's going to start, and that's always good. Neil, thank you very much for your time this evening. Rugbyleaguerecords.com is the website address. So go there now, have a look, join up, and learn something about the history of the sport. Neil, thank you very much for your time.
No worries. Thanks for having me.